The ancient cities where Jesus walked hide architectural secrets that slip past us during biblical readings. You might picture how homes were built or streets functioned, but archaeological reality extends far beyond simple construction. Stepping outside your dwelling after sunset in 1st century Judea meant facing genuine mortal danger. Police forces didn't exist. Street lighting was absent. City gates locked you outside if you arrived late. The existence Jesus and his disciples experienced resembled a survival documentary, and exploring that fascinating yet perilous routine, along with the remarkable aspects of Jesus' world, forms our mission today. Welcome to Andrew Restores History. If you're passionate about discovering how ancient civilizations truly lived, subscribe now and join our journey through time. Picture a camera hovering above Nazareth or Capernaum around the year 30. The initial impression would strike through color, or rather, its absence. Everything appeared monochromatic. A dusty brown palette dominated, created by rough-hewn stones and sun-baked mud bricks that camouflaged dwellings against parched hillsides. Forget those white marble avenues from epic cinema productions. The actual urban environments where Jesus traveled delivered a sensory assault of dust particles, smoke clouds, and suffocating proximity. Descending to street level, confinement hit immediately. What residents called streets were actually irregular dirt-packed alleyways, rarely exceeding 2 meters in width. Sidewalks separating pedestrians from traffic simply didn't exist. A basic journey to the marketplace became a physical contest for space between walkers, heavily laden pack donkeys, and wastewater frequently flowing down the pathway's center. This chaotic layout wasn't accidental, but defensive. Residences functioned as miniature fortresses, featuring thick walls without windows facing the alleyway, turning their backs toward the outside world. Streets were perceived as zones of danger and theft. Authentic living occurred inside, within courtyards. Yet this security pursuit created a curious acoustic paradox. Since structures pressed against each other to conserve materials and maintain structural integrity, sound insulation was non-existent. In villages of that era, silence represented an unaffordable luxury. The community operated as a single living organism where thin walls meant hearing your neighbor's arguments, a baby's crying, and grain grinding from the adjacent house. Privacy remained a futuristic fantasy. Existence unfolded under constant auditory surveillance from the clan, where everyone knew precisely what you were doing. A rigid survival hierarchy governed those alleyways. When a Roman soldier's or tax collector's silhouette appeared on horseback, blocking the light, local residents understood the protocol instantly. You needed to press yourself against the dirty mud wall and lower your eyes. In streets, where force was the only law, physical space belonged to whoever held the sword, and everyone else literally shrank to survive. Entering a common dwelling in 1st century Galilee produced immediate thermal and olfactory shock. Your eyes required several seconds adjusting to darkness, but your nose warned you first. The atmosphere was warm, humid, carrying a powerful scent of straw mixed with fresh manure. You'd expect to find a living room, but what existed was a biological heating system. These homes' architecture didn't prioritize comfort but survival against desert night cold. Without electricity or modern heaters, the solution involved bringing the most efficient heat source indoors, livestock. The entrance floor was packed earth where goats, sheep, and even a donkey slept. This might seem strange today, but sleeping while hearing a 50-kilogram animal's heavy breathing beside you wasn't a sign of extreme poverty. It was standard for most families. Animal body heat rose, warming the elevated stone platform where humans slept, ate, and lived. Exactly along this platform's edge, separating the human area from the animal zone, sat cavities carved in stone or wooden boxes for animal feed. that feeding trough's name was a manger. This completely transforms the classic Christmas scene we know. When we read, "There was no room at the inn, and the baby was placed in a manger," it doesn't mean they were expelled to an isolated stable in the middle of a field. They were probably in a relative's main room, already overcrowded, forcing the family to accommodate in the lower section alongside the residents' animals. If winter demanded this warm, malodorous squeeze, summer brought the opposite problem. When daytime heat transformed that stone box into an unbearable oven, domestic life migrated upward. The flat roof, constructed from branches and compacted mud, became the primary room. It was the only place to escape the ammonia smell below and feel some breeze. The ancient home was a survival machine where space was contested centimeter by centimeter. But if privacy's absence within four walls already seems harsh, the real social judgment occurred outside, at the sole location where water emerged from the ground. Today, when we feel thirsty, we simply turn a faucet and clean water appears effortlessly. But in first-century Judea, obtaining a simple glass of water represented the day's most laborious and politically dangerous work. Family survival depended entirely on women's physical strength, who needed to walk to the village fountain, often distant, balancing clay jars that, when full, weighed over 20 kilograms. Imagine carrying a microwave on your shoulder under intense sun every single day. Yet physical weight wasn't the greatest problem. Social weight was. The town well functioned as antiquity's social network. There, during early morning hours or late afternoon, news circulated. Marriages were arranged, reputations were destroyed. That space surrounding the water was a genuine open-air tribunal, where a woman's absence could be as condemning as her presence. If you wanted to know who had fallen from community grace, you simply observed the sundial. Respectable women went to fetch water in groups during the day's cool hours. Going to the well at noon under scorching sun wasn't a preference choice, but a clear signal of social exclusion. That's why the biblical account of the Samaritan woman fetching water at the 6th hour, meaning noon, says much more about shame than thirst. She preferred facing unbearable heat to facing neighbors' judgmental stares. And that water, so difficult to obtain, had a curious use. The Pharisees' and religious leaders' obsession wasn't with bacteriological hygiene, a concept that didn't even exist, but with ritual purity. Washing hands before meals or taking ritual baths in pools called mikveot didn't serve to kill germs, but to remove spiritual contamination from touching something or someone considered impure. You could be physically dirty with soil, but if you'd completed the ritual with water, you were considered clean before God. Water controlled life, hierarchy, and religion. But while existence in these Jewish villages revolved around tradition and the well, just a few kilometers away, a giant modern shadow rose, bringing a visual shock most people can't imagine Jesus witnessed. The classic image we hold of Jesus is a carpenter living in a quiet village isolated from the world. But geography tells a very different and visually striking story. Nazareth wasn't a desert island. Just 6 kilometers distant, less than an hour's walk, stood something that seemed to have landed from another planet. The city of Sepphoris. While Nazareth was a modest hillside village with perhaps 200 inhabitants, Sepphoris was a genuine metropolis for the region. Herod Antipas was reconstructing it as his capital with Roman architecture, paved streets, and a theater capable of seating thousands. Imagine the contrast. A young carpenter from Nazareth could wake up in a simple stone house smelling of goats, walk 1 hour, and find himself facing marble columns, mosaic floors, and an amphitheater where Greek plays were performed. That cultural collision wasn't distant or theoretical. It was a concrete daily reality. Many scholars believe Joseph and Jesus likely worked on Sepphoris's construction, given the massive building demand and proximity. If this is true, Jesus didn't just hear about Roman culture, he literally helped build it with his own hands while maintaining his Jewish identity. This geographic proximity explains much about Jesus' teachings. When he spoke of hypocrites, he used the Greek term hypocrites, meaning actor, someone wearing a mask in theater. That wasn't abstract religious vocabulary. It was a direct reference to what he possibly saw weekly in Sepphoris' theater. The collision between Jewish villages and Greco-Roman cities wasn't merely architectural. It was a daily psychological tension between two incompatible worlds attempting to coexist on the same piece of land. While cities like Sepphoris displayed Roman power and culture, they also represented something more sinister for common people: systematic economic exploitation. Rome wasn't just a distant government, it was a heavy hand entering your pocket and your dignity every single day. Tax collection didn't occur once yearly through a discrete ticket. It was physical and daily confrontation. Imagine being a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee. Before selling your catch, you needed to pass through local customs, where a publican, a Jew hired by Rome like Matthew, rummaged through your baskets. He possessed power to decide right there how much of your hard work would be confiscated to pay for the emperor's luxury across the sea. But money was merely part of the problem. A specific Roman law generated visceral hatred in the streets: the law of the mile. Any Roman soldier at any moment could stop a Jewish citizen mid-road, drop his heavy equipment at their feet, and order, quote, zero. And by law, the civilian was obligated to carry that bundle for 1 mile, approximately 1.5 kilometers. It was supreme humiliation. A family father could be treated like a pack animal in front of his children, forced to serve the army oppressing him. That's why when Jesus said, "If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2, the crowd must have been shocked. He was suggesting reclaiming control of the situation through defiant generosity, in a context where forced submission was the norm. And where did all that money and sweat flow? It didn't remain in poor villages. It flowed toward places like Caesarea Maritima, the Roman government's headquarters in the region. A dazzling port city built with marble and advanced engineering, featuring hippodromes and temples dedicated to Caesar. For a Jewish peasant, seeing that opulence was physical proof of their own exploitation, imperial architecture brought roads and aqueducts, but the price was the people's hunger. The city was a powder keg ready to explode in revolt at any moment. But while daytime brought tension from soldiers and taxes, sunset brought a different kind of fear, a primitive terror we moderns have completely forgotten. For us moderns, nighttime is merely a scenery change. We press a switch and life continues. But if you were in Jerusalem or Nazareth in the 1st century, sunset didn't mark the workday's end. It marked the beginning of mandatory confinement through fear. When the last light disappeared on the horizon, the city didn't just darken, it died. That era's darkness was absolute, something we rarely experience today with our light pollution. Public lighting didn't exist, except perhaps for occasional torches from a Roman patrol, which served more to intimidate than illuminate. Inside homes, light was an expensive luxury. Clay lamps burned olive oil, the same oil used for cooking. Keeping a light burning literally meant burning the family's food. That's why most people simply went to sleep as soon as darkness fell. This darkness brought fatal logistical danger. Walled cities had an inflexible rule. Gates closed at nightfall. If you were a delayed traveler arriving 5 minutes after closing, there was no negotiation. You'd sleep outside, leaning against the wall, completely vulnerable to bandits, wolves, and desert cold. The wall was the only dividing line between civilization and savage chaos. Even for those inside homes, security was illusory. Today, we think of thieves forcing doors or breaking windows, but in those villages of simple construction, criminals acted differently. The Greek term used in that era for thief often referred to someone who digs. This was because it was easier and quieter to dig a hole through the dried mud wall at the house's rear than attempt forcing the front door. The nocturnal terror was hearing the muffled sound of something scraping the wall while you tried to sleep. This changes how we understand biblical metaphors. When speakers talked about light of the world or walking in the light, the message didn't sound merely poetic or spiritual to original listeners. It sounded like an urgent physical necessity. Light was the only guarantee you wouldn't be attacked, robbed, or left outside the walls. But while the people feared the night's darkness that always ended at dawn, a definitive shadow was forming on the political horizon. A storm of iron and fire that would bring not just fear, but the total end of that world they knew. Those walking today near the western wall see gigantic stones, some weighing hundreds of tons, fitted with precision that defies even modern engineering. Looking at them, the feeling is of eternity. It seemed impossible that something so solid could fall, but that vibrant, dirty, and noisy world we've described until now had an expiration date. In the year 70 after Christ, the apocalypse arrived not with angels and trumpets, but with Rome's iron legions. The tension, boiling in the streets under tax collection and military brutality, finally exploded in open revolt. The empire's response was total annihilation. General Titus besieged Jerusalem, cutting off the supply from those caravans bringing food. The city that previously smelled of spices and animals began smelling of death. Hunger reached such a desperate level that historical accounts describe scenes of cannibalism within the walls. The society that valued ritual purity so highly ended up consuming itself in the siege's filth. When the walls finally gave way, fire did the rest. The temple, that economic and religious center that seemed untouchable, was set ablaze. The heat was so intense that gold from decorations melted and dripped through stone cracks, making Roman soldiers dismantle the sanctuary block by block to loot the precious metal. It was the literal and terrifying fulfillment of the prediction that not one stone would remain upon another. Physical proof of that moment exists that doesn't depend on faith, only on a shovel. If you excavate beneath the old city today, you'll find what specialists call the destruction layer. It's a black line of ashes, charred wood, and Roman arrowheads marking exactly where that civilization stopped. The stone's collapse led to the elite's collapse. The Sadducees, that wealthy aristocracy controlling temple commerce, disappeared from history overnight as their power base turned to smoke. Those who survived were precisely the groups not dependent on the physical building. The Pharisees, who focused on law study in local synagogues, and the followers of the Way, the first Christians who understood the real temple wasn't made of rock. Walking there today means walking over a culture's cemetery that tried challenging heaven and empire simultaneously. Herod's stones fell, but ideas born in those narrow, dusty streets survived the fire. And if you want to continue exploring antiquity's secrets that traditional history doesn't tell, click here on the screen to watch our documentary about what real life was like before the flood. Click the video on the screen to discover what living in a lost world was like.